Hello and welcome to a new video from our How-To webinar series. My name is Mario Sanchez and I run training here at Sumo Logic. And today we're going to be talking about how to create charts with your data. And once you have those charts built, how to add them to your dashboards, whether you're creating a brand new dashboard or how to add them to dashboards that already exist. So we're going to start with the 30,000 foot view. What are dashboards? What are panels? And you'll see in a second that that dashboards are made out of panels. But then we'll start talking about how to create those panels. And we're going to take a step back. We're actually going to show you first how to chart your data. So this is assuming you already know how to search your data, how to parse your data, perhaps how to aggregate your data, but then how to take those queries that give you insightful information and tweak them a little bit so that you're able to chart them. And once you have your charts, be able to create panels that you can add into dashboards. We'll talk a little bit about live versus interactive dashboards. For those of you who have been running with Sumo Logic for a while, you probably are very familiar with live dashboards, which you've been able to build always. But in the last couple of months, we've introduced interactive dashboards that allow you to do a little bit more filtering of your data. We'll talk about how to drill down and how to interact with these dashboards. So with no further ado, let me jump into the 30,000 foot view of how data flows into Sumo Logic. So first, on your left-hand side, you have data collection. And for the purposes of today and of building dashboards, we're going to assume that this has been done by someone. Someone's already created all the necessary collectors, all the already necessary sources, and we have data in our system. We're going to focus a little bit on the second part, which is searching and analyzing. So we use a vast number of operators to be able to massage our data, create some charts, and we'll talk a little bit about the chart area. But really what we're focusing on today is this third part, which is visualize and monitor. Not necessarily on alerts. We're actually following up a how-to webinar on alerts in the near future, but we're going to focus more on creating these dashboards so that you can display your data either in your operations center. Let's say you're sitting on a NOC and you want to have a couple of dashboards up there, or perhaps you want to create dashboards that have panels where you can interact with them and use them for analytical purposes, for investigation, for example. So all said and done, we're going to be focusing mostly on number 3 with a little bit of number 2 and a little bit of charts in number 2. Okay, so let's start with 30,000 foot view. So introduction to dashboards. Essentially, dashboards are a collection of panels. If you notice this on the bottom of your screen, you have a dashboard that has 3 different panels, and they just provide you a graphical representation of your data. The interesting thing is behind each one of these panels, you actually have a search or a query. So there is a one-to-one relationship between a search and a query. These dashboards have a little bit of interaction. One of the main ones is drill down capabilities. So if you were to click on any one of these dashboards, or I'm sorry, any one of these panels, it actually takes you to the query behind that panel, the query that brought that data to light. And that is fantastic, because if you were looking at someone else's dashboard, perhaps you want to find out how they built that query. You can always repurpose that query for your particular needs. So allow me to jump into my instance. I have a couple of dashboards here already open for your benefit. This one's called the Apache Visitor Access Types. And the interesting thing is that this dashboard actually comes out of the box with the Sumo Logic service. If you install the Apache app, these are the kind of dashboards that you get. This one is giving me visitor platforms, so the different platforms that my visitors are using. This one's showing me the device versions. This is showing me top 10 PC and Mac versions. This one is showing me the browsers and operating systems from these ones. So this one in particular happens to be a live dashboard. For those of you who have been using Sumo Logic, you're probably fairly familiar with these. These update on a regular basis. So every minute or so, I'll probably see this little spinning wheel here showing me that these dashboards are getting updated with that data. Let me show you another example. This one, again, coming from the Apache app, is showing you a dashboard that is giving you insight into traffic. Pretty similar to the previous one, except that this one has a dark theme that is preferred by a lot of our folks that have that are putting these up in their NOC centers. But again, this is a live dashboard. There's not a whole lot of interactivity. The little bit of interactivity that I can do with these dashboards is, if you look at this magnifying glass right next to the title of each one of the panels, I can click on that, and it just takes me to his it enlarges that particular panel so that I'm looking at that panel only. By default, when you do that, when you enlarge a panel, it will stop loading data for that panel. It assumes that you probably want to see a little bit more granularity and you don't want these to continue to update. However, if you do want them to continue update, you can click on this, and if you toggle it, you can toggle between pausing and letting it be live data streaming into those dashboards. Last but not least, the other interactivity that you have is what I was mentioning before about drilling. So if I want to find out the query behind this dashboard called top referrers, I can always click on that panel. And if you notice, it's taking me to my query, and it's showing me now the query called top referrers, which is the query itself that was used to generate that chart, which eventually got put into a dashboard. So we'll talk a little bit about how to put that chart into a panel and into a dashboard. But I wanted to show you the interactivity that you have with those dashboards and how you can actually drill down and find a little more detail. Because from here, I could actually go and say, actually, I want to see the top 10, and I can run this query as my own now for the top 10, and I will get a little more information in here as well. Okay, so let's go back into looking at some of the dashboards that we were looking at. I showed you two different examples. I wanted to show you a third example. This one here happens to be an interactive dashboard. And the reason why we call it an interactive dashboard is it allows you to interact with a dashboard. I can change, for example, the time range in each one of the panels if I wanted to. So in this case, this one is set to 60 minutes. I can change this one to be last 3 hours and so forth. Or if I wanted to change the time frame for all the panels, I could also do it from here. So it allows me to do a little bit more looking or finding of data, if you will. Let me go back for a second to one of the live dashboards I was showing you before, and I'm clicking about into the 60 minutes and I cannot change that. These are static. These are, again, meant more to be display dashboards that you would probably put in your NOC, but not necessarily to be interacting like this dashboard that I was showing you in here. Other ways that you can interact with these interactive dashboards are through filters. I can actually click on this little icon and have the ability to search using some predefined filters that I have applied to a dashboard. In this particular case, because this is a dashboard that I created, I have it in edit mode and I'm able to add filters to this particular dashboard. But we'll see as we go through this how you can use filters that have already been built into the queries. Okay, so that's the 30,000 foot view from as far as what are dashboards and how they can be used. This gives you a good visual cue in terms of the different chart types that we have available, and a few more should be coming in the near future, but at least you can start with these basic ones. And I'm going to try to sample a few of these and create some of those as we go through it. But like I said before, we have two types of dashboards: live dashboards and interactive dashboards. However, don't be surprised if in the next couple of months these two merge and we really only have one type of dashboard. But for now, the difference between live and interactive dashboards are that live dashboards are providing you a live stream of data. So in this particular example on the top of the screen, if I am looking for the last 6 hours worth of data, in the next minute, the new minute of data is going to load in here, and I will see updated information. And the last minute worth of the old minute, meaning minute after 6 hours and 1 minute, is going to drop off, and that data I don't see anymore. So there really isn't any backfilling of data. As a matter of fact, live dashboards, if you create a dashboard that is 6 hours, it actually takes 6 hours to populate because the data is actually loading real time. In contrast, interactive dashboards are more to be used as search-based or on-demand. So in that particular case, you can choose whatever time frame you want and you run that report. Instead of being live stream, you can run that report and you can backfill data. I can run for the last 30 days, I can run for the last 7 days, for the last 7 minutes, or last 15 minutes, and you get the point. In addition to that, interactive dashboards allow me to filter data. So in this particular example, I can see that I have something like status code. I can enter the status code I want to filter by, and my data would refresh with only that filtered data. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about live dashboard versus interactive dashboards, and you might be wondering, when do I use which? So I've put together this table that gives you an idea, depending on your use case, what you want to do. But to make it as simple as possible, here's the rule of thumb. If you're trying to put together dashboards that you're going to be displaying in your NOC center and your operations center, you're going to put them in some large screen displays, that's when you want to use a live dashboard. Live data that it's getting constantly updated. For anything else, you want to be using interactive dashboards. For example, if you want to do some forensics, or if you want to create a template to allow your analysts to explore some of the data, or perhaps you want to do some historical reporting, for all those, you'll be using your interactive dashboards. So with that said, let's go into the instance, and I'm going to show you how to build a lot of these dashboards. I'm going to go back to my query screen. I'm actually going to close some of these dashboards to make it a little easier on me to keep track of what I'm building for you. Okay, so I cheated a little bit, and before we started this how-to webinar, I actually created a few queries. And for the benefit of those who are not super familiar with our query syntax, I'm going to walk you through the code itself. Although, mind you, this webinar focuses more on creating the dashboards than the actual building of your queries and the searches and all that stuff. But in any case, here you go. In this particular case, I am looking for my Apache Access data. And I really care for the status codes that are not 200 and 304. So I care for all my status codes, but not necessarily 200 and 304, which are probably what I get the most if I were to look at my numbers. And then I'm doing a time slice, meaning if in this last 15 minutes worth of data, I'm going to create 15 buckets since I chose a 1 minute worth of time slicing. And then I want to do a count of status codes. So count how many status codes there are for the 404s, for the 300s, for the 500s, and count them by status code and by time slice, and then sort them. And that gives me this little answer down here. If you notice, I've got my status codes, and I've got my time slices, and then I have a count. So this tells me that there are 26 503s at this particular time period. And if I go down the list, I can see the different time periods and the different status codes, and I have my answer. But this is a little bit hard to read. So I'm going to introduce to you a new operator called transpose. And transpose works similar to pivot in an Excel spreadsheet. Essentially, I want to make my time my rows, and I'd like to make my status code my columns. So this transpose allows me to say my rows are going to be my time slice, and my column is going to be my status code. And if I run this now, I will get a better looking table for my data, which is getting me a step closer to be able to graph this data or chart this data, if you will. So this is a lot easier to read. This is telling me, okay, for this time slice 239, here are the number of status codes I have for these ones up here. So I can now easily run down the list and see, okay, my 403s seem to be very low compared to my 404s, for example, which are fairly high in this particular time series that I got here. All right, all that was just to show you how you can, there are some operators that allow you to manipulate how your data displays. So this transpose is fantastic because it allows me to create this table, but I'm not a computer. It's still a little bit hard to read. I'd love to get it in graphical representation. So this is where we introduce all your charting options. All these icons here on the right-hand side show me how I can chart my data. Before I ignore it, here's on the left-hand side is the ability to export my results. I can always take this results and off I go into Excel or a CSV file or whatever I want to do with those results. But my objective today is to show you how you can use the Sumo Logic tool to graph a lot of this data. So if I show you, I'm going to kind of walk from left to right, the different options that I have available. So here's horizontal bars. Here is vertical bars. I'm sorry. I could also do a line chart. I could have done an area chart as well. I could have done a pie chart. I could have done a single data point. And here's something interesting I wanted to pull up. So yes, I could do a single data point, but my point is that not all data series or I should say the other way around, not all options of graphing are good for all data series. If you look at this 98.8, in reality, what that is representing, I'm going to go back to the table to show you, is this first data point in here. So it's showing me just one data point because that's all that that this graph allows me to graph, this single value viewer. Similarly, if I were to go do the pie chart, I mean, this is pretty, but it's not really giving me a lot of insight. This is giving me a percentage by time slice, which is not that meaningful. Probably a better graph would have been a percentage by status code, in which case what I want to do is I would want to transpose so that my status codes are in here as a row and my time slice is my column, and that would have given me a much better representation. So you can play a little bit with your query to identify what is the exact view that you want. Let me go back here for a second, and I'm going to show you, unfortunately, we don't have time for me to show you all the settings for all these ones, but at least I'm going to show you a couple here so that you can get a good gist of the different settings. So I have a column chart. Whenever you choose any of these charting options, you can go to settings and start playing with some of these different options. I can change properties, like for example, I can say that I want my bars to be stacked normal. In this case, the color representing here is the size of how many things of my 404s. I could have made that stack to be a percent, in which case every single bar is 100%, but the size of the bar shows me the percentage of that particular status code on that particular bar. And you get the point. I'm going to go back and change this to no stacking. And from that, I'm also going to show you that I can go and do something like, let's say, change series. Here's what I'm going to do. I want to show the number of 404s in relation to the rest of my status codes. I want to find out broken links, for example. So I'm going to change my 404 to be a line chart. And in that particular case, what I'm doing is I'm creating essentially a bar line combo chart. My 404s are shown by this line in here, light blue, and everything else is shown as a bar right below. So you're starting to see how depending on what you want to highlight in your graphs, you have all these different options to be able to change what you want to do in your chart. Just for kicks, I'm going to change it to this last one. I'm going to leave it as a line chart, and in a little bit, I'm going to show you how to add this to a dashboard, whether it's a brand new dashboard or whether it's an existing dashboard. But before I go there, I'm going to show you a couple of other examples. So I talked about how some chart types are better for certain data types. Let me show you this example of plotting IP addresses in a map. So what my query here is showing, and I'm going to run it in the meantime, but I'm going to explain to you the query itself for those of you who are not too familiar with our query syntax. Again, I'm pulling source category equals Apache access. So I'm using one of my metadata fields to pull specifically Apache access data. And then I'm parsing the IP address out of all those messages. So I'm taking the IP address and I'm storing it in a variable called client IP. And then I'm using an operator called lookup. Lookup allows me to look for latitude and longitude from this service, and I'm providing the IP address on that IP address that I provided. And then my results, I am counting them by latitude and longitude, and then I'm just doing a little sort on that particular count. And there you go. Here's my answer down at the bottom. Just to get everybody on the same page, this is probably old news for you, but you have a messages tab where you can go and look at all the messages. I'm going to scroll here to the right-hand side. Here is the message. Right-hand side. There we go. Here is the message itself. Here's longitude and latitude. Here's the client IP that I parsed out. And here's a couple of other fields that were parsed out because this happens to be using a field extraction rule. That's a topic for some other webinar. But for now, let's go back to the aggregates and look at the fact that I'm doing a count on latitude and longitude. I'm doing a sort by count, and I end up with this kind of a table. Now, I could try graphing these tables with some of these other tools, and they probably are going to be a little bit meaningless. Oh, that's great that I can see that this latitude and this longitude has a high volume versus these other ones. So that's not all that interesting. Probably a little more interesting in this particular case is the map. Every cool kid has a map, and we're not the exception. So in this particular case, I can see how my map plots the IP addresses that it receives. This is the traffic that I've been receiving. And as you would expect, I can zoom into this stuff. Let's take a look at that New York area. And I can see how, as I zoom in, I would see more and more divisions of where the IP addresses where they're located, where my traffic is coming from. So good. That gives you a good example of yet another way of plotting data, another data type, chart type, I should say, that is found in here. And I wanted to touch on one more. This one only because the outlier operator is extremely helpful. So I wanted to at least bring it up in terms of charting. I'm going to run this so I can show you the data. But essentially here, what I'm doing is I'm pulling up status code equals 200. I'm again doing a time slice. So I'm looking at 60 minutes worth of data. If you look at here at the top right-hand side of your screen, and by time slicing it by 1 minute, I'm essentially creating 60 buckets. I'm doing a count on that status code, and then I'm using an operator called outlier. And essentially, outlier creates all these other um, columns for me that I'm highlighting. So here's my status code, which I pulled out. So this essentially says that at 12 p.m. on this particular day, I had 2,591 status codes, particular status codes for this, for 200 status codes 200. But this outlier also created an upper, a lower, an error, and so on. Let me show you first the diagram that it creates, or the graph that it creates. And notice how charts are all grayed out, because really the only way that I can chart this kind of data is using the line chart. And I get a chart looking something like this. What this is showing me is that this blue line in the middle is my data point, and that light blue shaded area around it is the standard deviation. It's showing me 3 standard deviations, and that's what these options in here are. It's showing me a threshold of 3 standard deviations. Let's change that to 1 to see what happens. I suspect my standard deviation shaded line is going to be smaller, and therefore it's going to be able to identify more points which are outside of the standard deviation. And that's what those triangles are marking. Those triangles are showing me violations in essence, or anomalies that are outside of the standard deviation threshold that I selected. Direction means whether I want to find out things that are above the threshold, and minus those things that are under the threshold. So my peaks and my valleys, essentially. And window, last but not least, window is showing me how many data points. Let's take this data point here. It's saying, how many data points do you want me to go back to identify what should be the right standard deviation for this particular data point? So there you go. This is a fantastic example of using graphs to easily identify things that are anomalies, that are outside of the norm, using what we call a line graph. Okay, so with that said, I've given you a few examples of how to chart your data. So once you create your query, you chart your data. And what I wanted to show you now is, how do I go about adding this chart to a dashboard? Well, the good thing is that that's the easy part. If I look here at the right-hand side, I have something called Create Panel. And if you remember what I was mentioning before, all dashboards are made out of panels, and every panel has a one-to-one relationship with a query. So the query that I just built and I ran and I charted, that's the query that I am creating a panel for. So let's call this, why don't we call this let's call this the Apache status codes, for example. And now, if you recall, I have live dashboards versus interactive dashboards. Here's where you decide whether you want to drop this into an interactive dashboard or you want to drop it into a live dashboard. And depending on which you choose, down at the bottom, you would have an option of adding it to an existing interactive dashboard versus an existing live dashboard. Or if you want to create it into a brand new dashboard, you can just type your name here. In this case, if I want to call it a brand new My Dashboard, I can just do that. But for purposes of showing you more interesting stuff, I'm going to add it to a dashboard that actually already exists. So the one I was showing you before was called the Apache Access Logs, and I'm going to add it to that one. So if I click on Add, what's going on right now is a new tab got created, and that dashboard is being loaded with my new panel in it. So just to reiterate, what I did here is once I created my query, I have some results, I charted my query, I'm able to click on Create Panel, and that is going to allow me to build a new panel that is going to go in a dashboard, whether I want to put it in a brand new dashboard or in an existing dashboard. So if you notice, here is my Apache Access Log. These are the panels that already existed in that dashboard that I'm showing you here. And down here at the bottom, it's actually loading my Apache status code that I just built. The cool thing about this is that I can move things around however I need. So for example, if I actually wanted to squeeze this panel up here, nothing is keeping me from dragging these ones and making them smaller so that I can move my brand new panel in there. So let me just show you. I'm going to move these ones in there. I'm going to put that one there. Sure, why not? Let's move this one up here. And I can move this one here, and I would shorten it out. And you can clean it up however you need. But in this particular case, there is my brand new panel that I just added to a dashboard. You notice that this is a dashboard that I own, therefore it's in edit mode. And right now I can toggle on or off, but since I just came into this dashboard adding a panel, of course, it's in edit mode. So what else can I add to dashboards? Let's talk about the different options I have here at the right-hand side and the different options I have in terms of editing a dashboard. I just showed you how to create a panel into a dashboard. Let's see what else you can do. I'm going to leave this in edit mode for now. Okay, let's start with this plus sign allows me to create a title panel or a text panel. I'll show you some examples of those. Here is a text panel. In this particular case, I'm using the text to give a little bit of context and explanation of what the data that users are seeing in these panels is all about. So incredibly helpful when you're putting a lot of different dashboards out there that would be hard to interpret. So you can always add a little bit of information. You can provide hyperlinks to other dashboards as well. You could provide hyperlinks to some other data outside of Sumo Logic if you wanted to as well. Nothing is keeping you from going to google.com, for example. The one up top here, this one is called a title panel. So it's just a way of giving your dashboard a meaningful title. I normally call this my internal name, and I call this one more my meaningful name, the name that it's a little more telling of what kind of data is in my dashboard. Okay, so that's what the plus sign it allows you to do. This one over here allows me to either delete the dashboard, or probably more interesting to you, to toggle themes. So if you notice, I can toggle between a dark theme, or I can toggle between a light theme for my dashboards. I know that a lot of people in our that have these dashboards in their NOCs prefer this darker theme. So here is the easy option on how to switch between the two. Next icon I want to show you is the ability to share your dashboard. In my particular case, this dashboard was already shared, so I can either grab this shareable link and share it with someone, or I will show you in a second the location, the library where everybody could go find this dashboard. If I did not want to share this with someone, as simple as that. I just click on only you, or I click on anyone in your organization and click on done. Let me show you where this dashboard gets searched. And this might be old news for you guys, but just in case, if I go back to my Sumo Logic UI, under library, I have a couple of options. My recent queries, I can see some of my favorite queries if I have starred any. I can see my personal queries. So everything that I've built and I've saved is shown in here. I can create folders, by the way, and store things in different folders. But I can also see anything that is out there, anybody in my organization who has shared any material. So for example, if I go to Latimer Louise, I can see that Latimer has shared a dashboard called Latimer Training. Or if I go to Nitin, I can see he has shared a couple of things in here as well. So If you notice, if I go to Mario, which is me, I can see that Mario has shared that Apache Access Logs dashboard, which is the one we were looking at before, the Apache Access Logs. I have shared that with everybody out there, and that's why you get to see them in here as well. Okay, excellent. All right, so what I've shown you so far is the ability to share your dashboards, ability to create some panels, the ability to move things about. You also have the ability to just refresh your dashboard so that, remember that this is not a live dashboard. Unlike a live dashboard, you have to request to run an interactive dashboard. So you can always hit refresh button, and that would go out and run and refresh all the panels with the latest information, because a lot of these are relative. In my case, all of the timeframes are relative, last 15 minutes. So if 5 minutes have already passed, maybe my data stale, I can refresh it. This icon, as you can imagine, allows me to expand it to use the entire screen. This one is pretty interesting. The filter icon allows me to either use or add filters. For example, if I click in here, I can add any of these filters to my dashboard. Where are these filters coming from? Well, that's interesting. These filters shown in here are the superset of fields that are found in all my different panels. So for example, URL might apply to some panels, but not all of them. Or let's say user. User might apply to some of them, but not all of them. So I'm going to click on add just to show you how this works. And there it is. I've added a filter called user, which I can go and tweak if I needed to. So maybe I'll call the label. Maybe instead of user, we use email ID, for example. Let me just put a little prettier label, and you can specify a default value if you wanted to. And then even more interesting is if this is a filter that applies to all dashboards, or do you want this filter to only apply to certain dashboards, in which case I'm going to take out the checkbox from here. So let's say that I want this filter to only apply to these two fields in here, and click on save. So now whenever anyone enters a value into this field, these two panels on the top right hand side would get refreshed with that data. As a matter of fact, let's try it out. I'm going to choose an ID that does not exist. So as you can imagine, it's not going to find any data because there's no data set up for that. But if you notice, as soon as I hit enter, those two dashboards started looking for new data, and they came back with there is no data to display, mainly because there is no data attached to me in this example. But this is how you would go about using filters and editing filters. Okay. Last but not least, in terms of icons, is my exit button here. If I click on this one, it allows me to sign out, and it's as simple as that. But what I want to show you now is the behavior if I'm not in edit mode. So if I'm not in edit mode, or if I was in a mode where I was, or if I was sharing this with someone else, this is essentially what they would get to see. You notice that they don't have the ability to edit the dashboards themselves. Instead, they have ability to interact with them only. So if they go and say, I want to look at filters, they don't have the ability to add filters. However, they have the ability to use the filters that you have added and you have suggested to this. So that's the difference between edit mode and not edit mode. You essentially are telling them, listen, this is a template and you can use it however you want, but I'm giving you the parameters within that you should be using for this. All right, last but not least, let me go back to edit mode. What else can you edit? You can actually edit the individual panels. Let's take this one, for example. Actually, let's take the one that we had just created so that we continue with that. So I can, if you notice, I'm going to toggle between edit and not edit mode up here. And this changes from that magnifying glass, which allowed me to zoom, if you remember this. It toggles between that, and it toggles between a cogwheel that allows me to go and edit that panel. So now, from these settings, I can do what I was able to do before, just a slightly different UI, but it's still, maybe I want to change it to a bar graph again, or to a column one, or perhaps I want to change it to a pie chart. I'm going to leave it as it was because it looked pretty, but this just allows me to change my mind and change it to another graph. Similarly, if I go to general, I can change it to stacking and so on. Essentially the same things I had before, except for one new one, and that's dashboard linking. If you guys remember, by default, let me cancel out of this. By default, when you click on a dashboard, I'm sorry, if you're in not edit mode, when you click on a dashboard, by default, it takes you to the query behind that dashboard. So here we go. It took me back to Apache status codes, and this is the query itself that, that I had done for that particular dashboard. That's the query behind that particular panel. But if you want to change that behavior, if you want it so that when someone clicks on this panel, it takes them to, say, another dashboard, then that's exactly what you can do in that particular screen I was before. Under General, I can link it to, say, another dashboard if I wanted to as well. The other screens here are the same. Y-axis, I can change the y-axis to be logarithmic if I wanted to instead of linear. I can specify the ranges if I wanted to make it very specific. I can change the color of my graph. If I don't care for that particular color, perhaps I want some lighter colors or a different color series, or maybe you want the same color series, but you want it to start in a different location. You can change that as well by choosing colors in here. Okay, and last but not least, I want to show you something. You can view the query from here. Now, you're not able to edit the query, and that's done on purpose. The reason why we don't allow you to edit the query from here is because we want to make sure that whatever changes you make to the query, that you test them first, that you run the query, you're happy with the query, you've seen the chart that it generates before you actually bake it into the dashboard. So whenever you want to change a query, here's what you need to do. You go back into non-edit mode, you click on that panel, and if you remember, that opens up the query itself, right? Now that the query is open, let's change something here. Let's not exclude these status codes. Let's do it for all status codes. I'm just going to do that as a simple change, and then I'm going to run this again to make sure that that is the graph that we want. And let's say that yes, we're happy, or perhaps we want to change that to a line graph instead of a bar chart, instead of a area chart. And now this is the chart that we want to change to. I have two options from here. The first one is pretty similar to what we had before. I could create a new panel. That means I can create a new panel in a completely different dashboard, or I can create a new panel in the same dashboard that I was before, or I can create a new panel wherever I want, brand new dashboard if I wanted to. Or the other option to the left is I can actually save it back to the panel where it came from. So Sumo Logic remembers, okay, this is a panel that I just came from. Do you want me to save this query back? So let's say yes. Let's click on that. And it says, great, I'm going to save it back to that panel. However, I noticed that you were playing with a different time range. Do you want me to keep that new time range? Or should I use what you originally had in your panel, which was the last 15 minutes? I'm going to put it to the last 15 minutes, click apply, and hopefully, if all went well, you will see that it's now refreshing with all the data. And there you go. Now my dashboard includes all the status codes as I had requested. Oh, actually, it's this one down at the bottom right-hand side. So we'll see in a second that it's going to include the changes I just made to that particular dashboard. It's no longer going to be, I think it was a bar chart, and it's now going to be a line chart from there. So that shows you how to go about editing the dashboards, either editing the properties of how you want that dashboard to look, or if you need to edit the query itself, we've just ran through the fact that you go back to the query, you edit the query, you run it, and you make changes to that dashboard. And we'll just wait for this to update here in a second. All right. Very good. There is one last thing I want to cover in terms of these interactive dashboards. So let me go back to the slides and let's talk a little bit about panel optimization. So here's the cool thing. Every time you're running interactive dashboards, or actually every time you're doing anything in Sumo Logic, we're trying as much as we can to optimize things for you, meaning have them run faster. So Sumo Logic attempts to optimize panels in your dashboard, and this is behind the scenes, when one of the two things happens. Either if you choose a time range that is greater than 6 hours, we're going to try to optimize that panel. Or if you try to share or publish a dashboard. So if you go back in here and you say, oh yeah, I want to share this thing, at that point, Sumo Logic in the background, by the way, here is the updated dashboard, the updated panel. So if you say, I want to share this dashboard, in the background, it's going to go and try to optimize this as much as it can so that it runs faster for you. Now, there are obviously optimized panels. The good thing about that is that they run parallel. So they can load much quicker because they're loading in parallel, whereas non-optimized panels run serially. So if you have two non-optimized panels, you have to wait for the first one to finish in order to start the second one. There are some limitations. Even though we try to optimize as many panels as we can, there are only certain operators that are supported for optimization. And this will change. We're going to be adding more and more of those. I'm going to click on that link, which takes me to the Sumo Logic help. And this talks a little bit about what I just walked you through, the optimization of your interactive dashboard panels. And down at the bottom, here is the optimization limitations. So essentially, we allow you, we optimize anything that is using these aggregations, but other aggregations outside of this one, we're not set up to optimize just yet. And also, if you're doing a group by, we allow you to, we optimize any of these operators before the group by, but we cannot optimize, for example, a lookup. In this particular case, it says, for example, you can add a lookup after the first group operator, but not before. So if you have a lookup before the group by function in your syntax, we're not set up to be able to optimize that just yet. And you will notice that because we have these different triangles showing that. So this means you're all good, you're optimized. This means we cannot optimize you because perhaps it's something that we don't support, or this red one means the run is too long and without being optimized, we just cannot support that. So going back to this one here, only certain operators are supported, and then queries that we cannot optimize that are actually larger than 6 hours, we cannot support through an interactive dashboard. You'd be forced to put that into a live dashboard. Let me just show you an example of those little icons. I'm going to go back to that Apache Access, and I'll show you, let's say this one. This one's a good example because in this particular case, I'm just going to toggle to make it a little easier to see. In this particular case, I have a map, and if you well, first of all, let me show you the message. It says this panel cannot be optimized, and it points you to the help, which is what we just looked at in terms of optimization. Let's go look at the query in the search. And what you will find out is that in the search, we actually have a lookup right before the aggregation. So we are not able to do, we cannot support we currently do not support the lookup operation before an aggregation, and therefore it's telling you that that panel cannot be optimized in that particular way. Okay. All right, so I think I've covered quite a bit of information for you today. I think in summary, I've covered the overview of dashboards and panels. So remember, panels or dashboards are made up of different panels, and there is a one-to-one correlation between a panel and a query, or a panel and a search, if you want to call it that. We talked about how to create dashboard panels out of your charts. So after you create your query, you create a chart. You can play with all the different options, and then you can add that to a panel within a dashboard. Once it's been added to a dashboard, you can still edit the properties of charts as well, as I showed you, including the query itself. We talked about the differences between live and interactive dashboards and when to use which one of those. So if you have doubts, pull up this video, pause it right when we have that table, and that'll give you a good idea of when to use a live dashboard versus an interactive dashboard. And last but not least, we covered panel optimization for interactive dashboards. The fact that behind the scenes, we try to optimize it as much as we can. There are some limitations in the optimization, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of how to start building your queries so you can take advantage of as much optimization as you can. Thank you for attending today's webinar, and I hope to see you on the next How To webinar series. Thank you.